Today we're going to be going over the inspection contingency as it is written into the offer to purchase, the specific contingency verbiage. We are really trying to have the PC classes that are held on Thursday mornings and the contract training topics really complement one another. So this month in December, it should be all things inspection related. So kicking that off, we're going to start with the home inspection contingency language itself. So um, then we'll get into negotiating next week and best practices around kind of like preparing to negotiate as well. So as always, stop me at any time with questions. And we'll get going. So the inspection contingency, there are kind of three main parts to the inspection contingency, three sections. So really defining an inspection versus a test, and some provisions for both the buyer and seller within this section. The inspection contingency itself, so defining and identifying the date in which it has to be done by, um, kind of setting the stage as well for the right to cure, which is the roadmap for the contingency when negotiations fail. So we'll be going through all three sections, and I always like to say as well when we're going over the inspection contingency, that it took me a while to wrap my head around the inspection contingency completely. So it's kind of, like with anything, the more you practice it, the more it becomes comfortable. And the more that you kind of see the different pathways in which the inspection contingency can go, um, you might not think of it until you are faced with the issue. So that's all just to say and to give you guys peace of mind that, you're not going to get it right away in terms of, right to cure and how it relates. This idea around meeting the deadline and the action you need to take if things are not worked out. So I just, again, kind of peace of mind that it's a hard contingency. It's the hardest contingency within our contract, and just give yourself some grace. So I definitely had to myself when I was learning it. So okay. So again, so this first section, it defines the inspection versus a test. So again, this is setting the stage for the contingency itself. And I'll just start reading it. So, and then we'll stop and talk about the highlighted areas. So the buyer may only conduct inspections or tests if specific contingencies are included as a part of this offer. So again, the buyer may only have it if the seller agrees to it, it's check marked, the contingency is checked, and seller agrees to it. An inspection is defined as an observation of the property. So that does not include an appraisal or testing of the property, other than testing for leaking carbon monoxide or leaking LP gas or natural gas, which is authorized. So further, a test is defined as the taking of samples of materials such as soils, water, air, or building materials from the property for lab analysis. So an inspection you can think of as an observation of the property. A test is where they're actually taking materials from the home and sending it off to a lab. Here, they really want to make sure that the two are distinct, because the testing contingencies are in another part of the offer. So here we're just strictly focused solely on the inspection contingency. The seller, so we're continuing on line 182, the seller agrees to allow the buyers, inspectors, testers, and appraisers reasonable access to the property upon advance notice. So that's again a provision for the seller. Mr. Seller, you need to make sure that you are giving access to the property for this inspector if we're agreeing to an inspection contingency. The buyer or the licensees or both may be present at all inspections and testing. So that's just information for us all, allowing the buyer to be there with just their inspector, or licensees may be present as well. We oftentimes get the question, do I need to be present at the home inspection with my buyer? It's not required in the contract, but it is best practice and a kind of a loose policy for us that we want to make sure that if you yourself as the buyer's agent cannot be present at a home inspection, that you are sending somebody else who can be there in your place. Um, I, I'll kind of go into just this idea of like, further cultivating your relationship with your buyer, being there as a resource for them, especially a first-time home buyer. You know, in practice, when you're there, that home inspector is going to be doing most of the talking with that buyer. But you can be there to help ease questions, ease worries about things that might come up, kind of talking them through what that negotiation process looks like once things are discovered. So um, definitely need to be there on behalf of your buyer and for your buyer, excuse me. Okay, so except as otherwise provided, the seller's authorizations for inspections does not authorize the buyer to conduct testing of the property. So again, they're saying this section um, is for inspections. This, if we're agreeing to an inspection contingency, we're only authorizing inspections unless we agree to testing of the property, which is, and again, another section of the offer. Any contingency authorizing testing should specify the areas of the property to be tested, the purpose of the test, any limitations on buyer's testing, and any other material terms of the contingency. This is all addressed again in the testing contingencies on the addendum A. So, but again, for areas of the state that do not use an addendum A, this is more so just a roadmap, a guideline for how that testing contingency should be written. Okay, so continuing on line 189, a provision for the buyer. So the buyer agrees to promptly restore the property to its original condition after the buyer's inspections and testing are completed unless otherwise agreed to with the seller. And this is a key term here. The buyer agrees to promptly provide copies of all inspection and testing reports to the seller. Seller acknowledges that certain inspections or tests may detect environmental pollution, which may be required to be reported to the Wisconsin DNR. What I want you guys to take away from that small section is that the buyer agrees to promptly deliver copies of the inspection report. Oftentimes we'll get the question, the buyer paid for it, do they need to send it? Yes, absolutely. The seller deserves a copy of the inspection report done on their home. Um, and, if should the offer fall apart, based off of what comes of an inspection, the seller is free to use that report and send it to other people. That's another question that we get often. So again, buyer is paying for it, but it is the seller's home and they are entitled to a copy of the inspection report. Okay, any questions before I move on? Okay, so again, this kind of is just setting the stage for the inspection contingency, really differentiating between an inspection, which is an observation, and a testing, and a test, excuse me. Okay, so now the inspection contingency itself follows that section. So beginning on line 193, you're going to X in that box if you are going to include an inspection contingency. And so the contingency only authorizes inspections, not testing. So again, it's saying it, really making it crystal clear that we're solely focused on the inspection process here. So bullet point one, this offer is contingent upon a Wisconsin registered or Wisconsin licensed home inspector performing a home inspection of the property after the date on line one of the offer that discloses known defects. So the takeaway here for you guys is that it must be conducted by a Wisconsin licensed home inspector. We can't have Uncle Joe, who's really handy, perform a home inspection. It has to be done and conducted by a licensed home inspector in the state of Wisconsin. So they've got their own um, licensing requirements that they must adhere to and their own code of ethics that they must adhere to. So it's a standard performance from all home inspectors. Bullet point two. So this offer is further contingent upon a qualified independent inspector or independent qualified third party performing an inspection of, and this is where you can list additional property components that are outside the scope of the general home inspection, excuse me. So these could be things like an outbuilding, a pool, a hot tub. Those are components of the homes that are outside a general home inspector's purview. Um, so if there are components that like that, you would need to list them additionally here, independently here. The second the second area where this is where these lines are used for are to list any components that you know that the buyer would like inspected right away. So I'm going to circle back to that. I'm going to read bullet point three, and then I'm going to tie that into bullet point two. So buyer on bullet point three, buyer may have follow-up inspections recommended in a written report resulting from an authorized inspection, provided they occur prior to the deadline specified at line 206, and inspections must be performed by a qualified independent inspector or independent qualified third party. So again, in practice, the buyer is going to have their home inspection, and the home inspector is going to identify areas where they feel a follow-up inspection might be warranted. So maybe you've got a roof that has compromised shingles, and the general home inspector uh, states, okay, I can see that these are compromised. I do suggest having a follow-up inspection from a roofer to see exactly what's going on with the roof. Or another good example would be if a um, foundation wall measured out of plumb. Then that home inspector is going to also call for a follow-up inspection on that foundation wall. I can see that it's moved out of plumb. Now we need somebody with a little bit more expertise to give you guys an idea of what's going on here. So you can only have those follow-up inspections if they are recommended in that written report. If you know that you want a component like that to be inspected right away, then you would want to list it here on lines 197 and 198, so that you don't have to rely on the home inspector to make the recommendation. You could say, when you're showing the property, for example, maybe you notice when you're showing the property, and this is before you're writing the offer, you notice a huge crack in that in the foundation wall. You could say to that buyer, we can rely on the general home inspection to make that recommendation for a follow-up inspection here, that follow-up foundation inspection, or we can just go ahead and ask for it right away because you know that you want to make sure that this is addressed in some way or you are investigating this in some way. So you would go ahead and just list foundation right on line 198. That way you can line up the foundation inspection right away along with this general home inspection if you wish. If it's not written in this line, then you have to wait until that general home inspector calls it out. So that's very important to make sure that that's understood in terms of kind of the order of operations in which you can have these follow-up inspections. So I've got some agents who will just right off the bat, they'll say we want foundation, roof, and if there's a chimney at the property, they'll say chimney right away. So again, it's just a case by case basis. And if the property looks good overall, then you could just leave it blank and just see what comes of that general home inspection and if it's recommended or not. So, okay, so continuing on line 203. So the buyer shall order the inspections and be responsible for all costs of inspections. I love that this is just laid right out in the offer. You don't have to have any awkward conversations with the buyer about these costs. And in your buyer consultations, this is something that you can identify to the buyer, in terms of having that discussion on, excuse me, the light turned off, in terms of expected costs for the buyer. You're going to have your closing costs and your costs for inspections. So, when I'm doing a home or a buyer consultation, I'm usually quoting them about 350 to 500 for a general home inspection. 204. Okay, so this is a caution line that's setting up for line 206. So the buyer should provide sufficient time for the home inspection and any specialized inspections as well as any follow-up inspections. So this is a caution for the buyer to make sure you've got to have enough time to have the home inspection, any follow-up inspection, and they all have to be done within this 10 to 14 day period or whatever date you guys choose. So on line 206 is when we're identifying the inspection contingency deadline. So the contingency shall be deemed satisfied unless the buyer within, and it defaults to 15. I put in here 10 to 14 days as kind of your guideline. I feel that that's plenty of time to get the general home inspection done, follow-up inspections, and negotiating done. And this date can definitely be amended if buyer and seller agree to a later date if you're finding that you're running out of time. So that happens fairly often, which is fine. So unless the buyer within 10 to 14 days after acceptance delivers to the seller a copy of the written inspection report dated after the date on line 1 of the offer and a written notice listing the defects identified in those report to which the buyer objects. So that's a notice of defects. Line 209, a proposed amendment is not a notice of defects and will not satisfy this notice requirement. Lines 210 through 211, for the purposes of this contingency, defects do not include structural, mechanical, or other conditions the nature and extent of which buyer had actual knowledge or written notice before signing this offer. Lines 212 to 215 goes on to define what a defect is. So the way that this is written doesn't really, to me, it doesn't completely map out how the inspection contingency is done in practice. So I usually like to spend a lot of time here in terms of what you're actually doing as it relates to receiving this inspection report, having those follow-up inspections, and gathering information to go ahead and negotiate further if needed. So, again, line 206, you've got this deadline identified. So let's say we've got a 14-day deadline for the inspection contingency. So within 14 days, calendar days, after the accepted offer, that buyer is going to get their home inspection scheduled. You're going to have the home inspection, and it's going to come up with defects. It's going to identify safety issues. It's going to identify deferred maintenance. And it's going to identify things that are at the end of their life that the buyer might need to budget for. Um, Taking all of this information in, I've got a chat. Let's say we put a chimney roof and whatever else inspection on line 198, but the buyers change their mind about getting the chimney inspection done. You do not still have to get it done, no. But I would say that it's definitely better to err on the side that you're going to and write that into line 198 and then just not have it done versus trying to renegotiate that after the fact. So good question. Um, okay, so you're going to have this general home inspection. You're going to be um, given the results of the general home inspection, again, identifying defects, safety issues, deferred maintenance, and things that are at the end of their life. With that information now, say a foundation and roof follow-up inspection were called out in this general home inspection. So you go into what's I call like an information gathering stage. You are going to get that follow-up inspection from the about the roof and the follow-up inspection about the foundation. From those two follow-up inspections, it might be learned that the roof needs $3,000 worth of repairs, and the foundation, two of the walls measured out of plumb. So the recommendation there is going to be $10,000 worth of bracing. So you've got, what did I say, 3,000 for the roof, so $13,000 worth of defects. Um, with that information now, the buyer can go to the seller and see if they will negotiate on any of those items. These are all items that, the seller may not have had any knowledge of, which is 9 times out, well, it should be 10 times, 10 out of 10 times the case that the seller just had no knowledge of these things. And that buyer now, you know, okay, I am okay with moving forward with this, um, with the purchase, but I do want to see some concessions here because of the fact that there's $13,000 worth of issues. So that buyer can go ahead and attempt to negotiate with the seller. So when the um, offer here is stating that the buyer is going to deliver a copy of the written inspection report and a copy of a written notice listing the defects, and then it follows up by saying that a proposed amendment is not a notice of defects, that's a little muddy for us, right? So really what this is saying is that you're not going to be sending this notice of defects right off the bat. We're going to send this amendment and attempt to negotiate via an amendment before we get to this notice stage. Um, so we're not, and I'll get to the notice of defects when we talk about the right to cure. But at this stage here, we are attempting to negotiate with the seller via a proposed amendment. Um, a buyer can go to a seller and they can ask for anything that they want. And it's our job as buyer's agents to really keep those things to a reasonable level in terms of like very much educating them on like, okay, what are the major defects for and safety issues versus like deferred maintenance or things that you might need to budget for later. They're working now, but they're not, but we might need to budget for a replacement, within the next 3 to 5 years. Okay. So just kind of really focusing on those defects. We're going to go to the seller and we're going to say, okay, Mr. Seller, we want you to give us $13,000 off the purchase price so that we can go ahead and take care of these things after closing. Or a buyer might say, I want you to take care of these things prior to closing, and then we'll all go to the closing table. A seller is going to receive this proposed amendment and they're going to determine whether or not, okay, I will agree to fixing all of these things, and then we'll all go to closing. Or the seller has the option to say, I'll agree to fixing the foundation, but I'm not going to agree to fixing the roof. Or the buyer or the seller could say, no, I'm not going to fix all of it. I'm not going to fix any of it, excuse me. Um, I like the line, when you're kind of educating your buyers on this, is to say the seller can agree to some, none, or all. So, and then the ball is back in the buyer's court to determine what they want to do based off of that information. So, in a perfect world, buyer is proposing their amendment and seller is agreeing to it right away, and everyone's going to closing. You guys are coming to a meeting of the minds based off of what those defects were. Um, or a seller is going back and saying, I can do A, but I'm not willing to do B. And buyer can say that at that point, okay, I'm okay with that. We'll just rewrite another amendment, just saying that the foundation will be fixed and then we'll take care of the roof after closing. So again, they're agreeing to it on an amendment and everyone's going to closing. Let's say the seller said, no, I'm not fixing any of it. Then the buyer now has to determine, okay, they're not going to agree to any of it. What do I do now? So the buyer has the choice of, okay, I'll just go to closing. Maybe this is their dream home. You know, maybe they're just in the grand scheme of things, they have determined, I'm okay with taking on these costs after closing. The bigger picture here is that we just want to get into this house. And that buyer could make that determination and everyone could still go to closing even though there were no repairs that were agreed upon. Or now, and this is where the notice of defects comes in, that buyer can choose now, we have a breakdown of negotiations, that buyer can choose to send what's called a notice of defects. And then we'll get to the right to cure with that. So the right to cure only kicks in if this notice of defects is delivered. So we've got this breakdown of negotiations. Seller or the buyer is not willing to move forward without seeing something done. So at this stage of the offer, we're going to assign and we're going to negotiate whether or not the seller has the right to cure or not. So in the right to cure, we're going to say the seller shall or shall not have the right to cure the defects. If we're going to be giving the seller the right to cure, the seller may satisfy the contingency by delivering a written notice to the buyer stating their election to cure the defects. I'm going to go through this language and then we'll go back through how it works in practice. They'll cure the defects in a good and workmanlike manner, and then they'll deliver to the buyer a written report detailing the work done no later than 3 days prior to closing. If the seller does not have the right to cure, the offer is going to be null and void, taking that same notice of defects, and the seller does not have the right to cure, then the deal is dead. The deal will also die if the seller has the right to cure, but the seller has elected not to cure the defects, or the seller does not timely deliver the written notice of election to cure. So really what this right to cure is doing is providing the roadmap for who has the power to kill the deal if this notice of defects is sent. So again, we've got that breakdown of negotiations. Buyer says, okay, I'm going to write a notice of defects. And I'm going to list all of the defects that I now want the seller to cure. If the seller has the right to cure, the seller is going to take that notice of defects. And now this is where it's kind of like a final line in the sand, where before the buyer was asking the seller to repair them or give concessions in the form of a price reduction based off of that roof and the foundation. Seller said no. Now the buyer is saying, okay, you've got the right to cure. Now I'm forcing your hand. You've got to fix these things or you've got to let me out of the deal. So now it becomes in the buyer, excuse me, it becomes in the seller's court to determine, okay, well, before I was not willing to fix those things, but now they've served this notice of defects. Now I have to fix these things or let this seller or let this buyer go. And it might be at this point that the seller might say, shoot, I don't have another buyer waiting in the wings. It's December. I don't know that I'm going to get another offer in a timely manner. Before they asked via an amendment, I said no, but now I've got this notice of defects, and now I'm going to say yes because my circumstances have changed. I'm just going to let them, I'm just going to fix it, and then we'll all go to closing. Or that seller can still hold firm and say, no, I'm not going to fix these things. I'm just going to release you now, Mr. Buyer, and we'll part ways. If the seller was not given the right to cure in that same scenario, the buyer is going to deliver that same notice of defects. Again, they're saying to the seller, okay, you said no when I asked you if you would fix the roof and foundation. You don't have the right to cure. I'm going to deliver this notice of defects, and now I'm out. So the ball was in the buyer's court to kill the deal because they did not give that seller the right to cure. As I was saying in the meeting last week, it's really hard to wrap your head around the right to cure, and even explaining it to a buyer because you're hoping it never kicks in. This is providing the roadmap for the contract if those negotiations break down. We're hoping that you're going to have your home inspection, it's going to identify defects, buyer goes to the seller and asks for concessions in some form, and seller and buyer are coming to a meeting of the minds on those repairs and everyone's going to closing. And that notice of defects is never going to even get kicked in or delivered because buyer and seller have come to an agreement. Again, this is only kicking in if that notice of defects is delivered because negotiations somehow broke down. I think the best way um, to explain it again is just to say this is determining who has the power to kill the deal should it get down to this point. But Mr. Buyer, we're hoping it never gets down to this point. Another spot where the notice of defects has a role is if you're coming down to this deadline, and let's say you guys have not been able to successfully negotiate anything, and maybe a seller is willing to still negotiate, but you're coming down to this deadline. You don't have an agreement to extend the inspection contingency. As a buyer's agent, if we're getting down to this last day of the inspection contingency and no agreement has been made, we need to get that notice of defects off to a seller, because otherwise the contingency will waive itself and the buyer is going to be agreeing to buy that home as is. So that's also very crucial to understand that unless that notice of defects is delivered or unless we have come to another agreement via an amendment, that buyer will be buying the house in the state that it is. So if we're coming down to that deadline and, again, no agreement has been made, but you know that the seller doesn't want or the buyer doesn't want to buy the home as is either, we need to get that notice of defects off to the seller. The next day, if buyer and seller are able to come to an agreement via an amendment, that notice of defects can definitely be retracted. But I just want to make sure that it's really understood that we've got to get that notice of defects off if no other agreement has been made. Um, and I will say too, and at the WRA, that's probably the one question that they get a lot. Hey, we're past our inspection deadline and buyer and seller have not agreed to anything, and we haven't sent off a notice of defects. What happens? Well, then the WRA attorney has to say, well, your buyer just bought that as is, technically. So again, you're going to use it for that purpose as well. Um, this home inspection flow chart, there's a different version of this. It's the same content. It just looks a little bit different now that the WRA issued. This is a flow chart that I had um, up on my wall when I first started practicing and first started selling to map out again if the seller has the right to cure down here. Okay, if there's defects, which way does it go? If there are no defects, which way does it go? If the seller does not have the right to cure, which way um, can the contract go? So this was really helpful tool for me, and we'll make sure that it's available to you guys as well. But definitely just a good visual for people.
Yeah.
Yes, Kathleen.
Um, is it okay to ask a question now? I just
Absolutely, please.
um, the if the amendment is agreed to before the deadline, you don't have to also send the notice of defects.
Correct, because you guys have come to an agreement on what's going to happen with those repairs. Inspection contingency is waived, and everyone's going to closing. Correct.
Okay,
Good question.
thanks.
Yes. So this is just a summary of, again in practice. Again, like at first, you're always going to have this amendment. You're going to be in that amendment stage, versus a notice of defects. We just highly encourage to negotiate, negotiate, negotiate. As a buyer, you know, even if it's a doom and gloom inspection, general home inspection that came back, I would never walk away from a deal without at least attempting to ask. You don't know what the seller might say. I would always, again, encourage any buyer, let's not walk away from this right away. Let's see what the seller's willing to do. So, obviously there are going to be some exceptions if something is, so far, a bigger expense than anyone wants to deal with or the buyer wants to deal with. Um, even just I can just think of a scenario right now that one of our agents is going through where um, it's a potentially a compromised foundation. I think that we had an engineer in and they did deem that it was fine. But the way that it's a newer construction home and the way that it was built just initially, the buyer was still not comfortable with it. So an engineer was able to say to that buyer, it's structurally sound, but the buyer just still is not comfortable moving forward with the transaction because of the way that the house was originally built. So, again, that was kind of a scenario, a one-off, where even if it was fixed, Mr. Seller, even though you've given me peace of mind with this engineer, I'm still not willing to go forward. So that's still all being hashed out, but that's just kind of a most recent example that I can give you guys. Um, and then with follow-up inspections, so as a buyer's agent, this is really where your time to shine is through this inspection period. Um, in terms of, okay, so your general home inspection has revealed or has recommended that we get a follow-up on the electrical and the plumbing and the roof. Like I will coordinate, I'll get these things coordinated, or I'm going to suggest that you guys get these coordinated. This is where, as a buyer agent, you need to be giving that advice. As a agent of the seller, you know, you wouldn't be giving that same advice. You'd have that general home inspection, and then you can let the customer tell you what they want to see done, but you're not proactively giving that advice. So just kind of be mindful of that in terms of your role as a buyer agent. Um, and then clarifying language around the right to cure in good and workmanlike manner. So I'm going to show you guys that. Um, this is a clause that we definitely recommend that you put into the offer to purchase. And this is in our clause library. This is not something that we have crash printed in the offer, um, because again, every transaction is different. But I would definitely use this language if you're giving the seller the right to cure. This expands the definition of good and workmanlike manner. So I'm going to go back to um, the right to cure. So, excuse me. So when the seller has the right to cure and they've elected to cure, they, looking at bullet point 2 here on line 220, they can cure the defects in a good and workmanlike manner. And that is the definition in which they need to abide by in order to get those defects, quote unquote, cured and repaired. This is where we run into a lot of trouble in terms of the next kind of possible point of contention as it relates to those cured defects. So, good and workmanlike manner is very vague, right? So, as a buyer's agent, you might say, all right, the seller can cure in a good and workmanlike manner using professional licensed experts with the benefit of a permit as required and in accordance with municipal building code and generally accepted construction and safety standards. The scope of work shall be defined by an independent third party. So it expands on that good and workmanlike manner, giving the buyer a little bit more peace of mind in the fact that licensed experts have to be used and the scope of work has to be defined by an independent third party or a qualified third party. So you can insert this right into the offer to purchase if the buyer is giving the seller the right to cure in the home inspection contingency, then I would definitely be adding this. Again, just a little bit more peace of mind for your buyer in terms of this expanded language. Good and workmanlike manner is pretty vague, right? So
And you're putting that in the additional
provisions.
contingencies provisions. Good.
Yep. Um, okay, and then that's just final reminder. Your most important value to your client is to negotiate for your client's needs, especially in the inspection contingency. So use the amendment for this and make sure you have given it enough time to arrive at a win-win. Um, I just always like to just, again, kind of give people this peace of mind in terms of the inspection contingency is hard and it's the hardest one to get through. And once you're through it, you're going to have 9 times out of 10, you've got smooth sailing in terms of the rest of the contract and the financing contingencies and the appraisal contingencies. Those are not nearly, as tough to get through as the home inspection contingency. So it's the first one up, first one out of the way. And really, again, as a buyer's agent, your time to shine with your buyer in terms of, this is really where you're showing your value with your commission, I feel, is in this inspection process. So, um, any other questions? Kathleen, thank you for your good question.